Mackenzie Wark is a writer and scholar. She's the author of numerous books, including most recently the phenomenal Reverse Cowgirl, which came out just this February. We're thrilled to have you on our team here, Mackenzie, and to have you joining us today. I'll now hand it over to you to introduce Lyle.
Oh, I was doing that part? I don't even have Lyle's bio in front of me.
Okay, I can introduce that.
Thank you.
We don't have to do introduction.
Okay. One sec.
Well, Lyle, I can just you're kind of a legend. You're
Well,
someone.
Hi everyone.
And I'm gonna put up the slideshow. You very generously put some images together for us, and we're gonna learn about you through your work, I think, today. Yeah. So it's like what Hegel says about the preface. You can't preface the book unless you know what the book already is. So do you want to tell us a little bit about The Watering Hole in 1996 and why you chose this particular show to introduce us to your work?
Well, thank you. First, I would like to thank you, Mackenzie. It's really a pleasure to, I've been a fan of your work for many years. In fact, I was thinking about in the shower right before the Zoom. In fact, the dates for The Watering Hole correspond to your legendary book, your correspondence with Kathy. So it was interesting that you could probably speak about that period as much as I can, because I think they correspond to the particular period. But before we start, I wanted to just thank Fong and the Brooklyn Rail for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I am nervous. These things are always, this new social environment that we're in. So it's, so I'm just going to just say that. I'm feeling a little nervous about sharing. And, but I went for a little walk today, had to have some relaxing tea in front of me. And and also, so I decided to open up with this because in a way, this is as many of you probably know, this The Complete Watering Hole from 1996. And it was through generous donation through friend and patron Aggie Gunn. The MoMA acquired it a few years ago. And at the time, the critic, photo historian, Vince Letty said it was great that they got it, but it'll never see the light of day. So I'm interested in what has happened because of its content. I am interested in what has happened in terms of even pre-COVID-19 in the last, let's say, 5-10 years, in terms of social movements, in terms of institutions feeling the need to somehow, I hate the word diversify, but in a way to get more teethy in terms of the type of image making or work that they are engaging the public with. So I thought it would be an interesting thing to start with that. The Watering Hole is a work from, as I mentioned, from 1996. And I just want to give a couple of dates, because, this work is interesting for me in that I'm a professor at NYU, and it's an interesting pedagogical, tool in the sense that if you think several years ago that there was a point where a lot of dealers were attending, let's say, even undergraduate, final shows looking for the next fresh meat. And I think in a lot of ways that applied pressure on both undergraduates and graduates in a way to present themselves as ready, if you will. And I like the story of The Watering Hole because I remember when the work first made its appearance at Jack Tilton Gallery in '96, it was my second show. I remember Jack Tilton and I almost got into a fist fight because he said to me, "Where's that winning image?" The first show had been wildly successful, critically, etc. And if the first show is about the nation, if you will, this show is about disintegration. And I want to just, although it's dated 96, there are certain images in this particular 9-panel work that would definitely go back to, let's say, Act Up 87 or Dharma being found, the story of the accusation about Dharma coming to into light, Magic Johnson, coming out with HIV, and the LA uprising in '92. And in a way, the images, these 9 panels comprise a particular period of also personal archive work, et cetera. And for Brooklyn Rail, this is a little gift from the give Ewing Fong, is that this letter that appears with the D, this is the first time I'm actually showing this. It's part of the Warden Hall archive. And I've been looking for this letter because I did a performance, a participant just a couple of years ago, and it was around after my father had passed away, and I could not find the original letter. So in order to make that piece that we'll see later, I had to sample it from the transparency of the work. But in this new period in COVID-19, when I'm starting to think about the archive, I just came across this vault, if you will, that has all the original content. So this is the first time I'm actually sharing this with you. So this is the letter that I'm actually seeing for the first time last night, since '96. So I just wanted to share that. So shall we move on?
Yeah, well, look, I just want to tease out a little bit that remark about, like, it might have been acquired, but will it ever be shown? So there's the what's in the stack and what is actually ever shown is one thing on the institutional side, but then you're also talking about, for you have your own archive of this particular slice of culture that's really not terribly well documented at all. But then, there's this selection on this side, and then there's a selection on the other side, on the institutional side. And maybe it's worth just pausing to ask, what gets left out of both of those.
Well, I think it's not just the institution. I think in terms of there was a systemic shift in terms of not just with institutions, but artists, critics, collectors, the culture itself. Thinking about, I remember, growing up in the Bronx, growing up queer, being called faggot, sissy, et cetera, and the trauma around that. And then I remember with the Black Male exhibition that I was in '94, and the resistance to the type of imagery that I had in that show, and in a way that I did not fall within the paradigm of, let's say, Black masculinity. But 5 years later, I'm being hired by Vibe magazine to shoot Missy Elliott and other hip hop artists. So it's not just within the art world, but in the larger culture itself, how work such as these, or I'm part of a generation that actually applied pressure, if you will, to the culture to give it elasticity, to expand, et cetera. And I'm obviously not the first, but I'm definitely have been inspired by the generation that came before me. I'm thinking about also looking at the archive. I recently came across, and I posted this letter that I had not seen since I received it. It's a letter from the great late poet Essex Temple, and I remember him sharing it with me, and I posted it on Instagram, that what did it, at that time being young and background that I came from, and not feel like I didn't have a voice, if you will. And it took someone like him, who was a big brother, said that, well, we earn our warrior marks, So I'm just sort of sharing it with you because I think it's pertinent to where we are today, being like yourself, an academic. I remember I was sharing with my NYU students a few weeks ago now. I remember one student saying they were bored, and this was early in the sheltering down. And I said, when Greg Borowitz was dealing with advanced stages of HIV, in the late early 90s, he didn't have time to be bored at 21. He collaborated with Douglas Crimp and created, which is a seminal book on AIDS activism. But it is curious to think about the arc of that, because I was sharing with the students, well, the reason they are, or someone's paying $70,000, it has been a dress rehearsal up until now. Now we can all deal with the work of issues of intimacy and gaining access. And since they're going to be the next generation that offers a narrative for where we are right now. So the students, even thinking about my classes, when I go in a 3-hour class on Wednesday, saying how you're doing. And it takes a while for them to reconstitute themselves, through the realm of terror, et cetera. And then at the end of 3 hours, they don't want to go up to class, and have students calling in, whether in Singapore on quarantine. And when I say, I'm not in quarantine, I'm sheltering down, she's in quarantine with the police outside the door. If you leave the house, you get fined several thousand, plus you might lose your citizenship, or a student in Korea. So I am interested in the pedagogical moment, how it gives a time for the youth to really imagine what might be possible, et cetera. So.
Speaking of which, I think maybe we'll, move on to the Ektachrome archive. Ektachrome being a standard of color film reproduction shared by several different companies. I love it actually that you named it after a media technique. Kind of speaks to me. But to think about
should I talk a little bit about the discovery of these, or how
yeah, well, it's just the one thing I wanted to say is it's kind of a body of work that's working with archives that are not just yours. Yeah, these you're drawing in several that are kind of like a family legacy, if you like, and if we could broaden it out a little bit to that as well.
If I could cut in for just a second, a few viewers are asking if we could if we could put it into slideshow mode. Do you think that's something we could do?
Sure. How do I do that?
Right at the top between animations and review is a button that says slideshow.
At the top of...
right where you are, to the right.
Slideshow.
Yes. And then presenter view.
Hang on a sec, I gotta make another thing go away.
Take your time.
Thank you for doing this.
Slideshow.
Shall we do presenter view?
I'm not seeing that though. Presenter view.
There
we go. I got it. There we go. How's that?
Oh, one sec. Can we go back?
Should I look at the chat and that? I remember with Cecily Brown was on, she was saying that there was a lot of unsavory, but I'm sure things have gotten worked out since.
Yeah, well, that's presented view.
I think this will, yeah.
How's that? Slideshow?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, so we're talking about the Ektachrome archive, and then I want to sort of broaden this out, but it's your archive and then also some other Ektachrome sets that you had. Yeah, that's my understanding anyway.
Well, what happened was my grandfather was a photographer, and he shot over 10,000 slides documenting his friends and family, the church, etc. From, let's say, I think Ektachrome was founded in 47. I think he was shooting as early as the late 40s. In fact, I inherited his Leica from him, and I inherited the archive. My first show was images, formal portraits of my family juxtaposed against Ektachrome's images my grandfather taken of his family. But the Ektachrome archive itself is a different project. And I lived in Ghana. I was got invited by the then vice provost of NYU, Yao Nyako, was an economist, to go to Africa. I lived in Africa as a child, and he thought it would be good. I would be helpful in helping to co-set up this program, NYU program in Accra. NYU at that point, it had campuses in Paris, London, Tel Aviv, etc. And he felt it was important to have one on the continent of Africa. So I went over in 2005 for a semester. I fell in love with the people, the culture, and someone. And that one semester appointment turned out to 7 years. In fact, my tenure at NYU is based on the research I had done there. But upon my return in 2013, I rediscovered these slides that I had deposited in my mother's home in the Bronx in 2000, when I did a pre-Rome in Italy, and everything was taken out of the studio. So coming from a very formal society of Ghana, where I had a very professor and I was directing an art center there, I re-engaged with this punk aesthetic, if you will, let's say from the early 90s, 90s to let's say 2000, hovering around 92. And the initial prompt, because Isaac Julian was getting ready for his show 10,000 Waves at the Modern, he asked me to use some of my snapshots. So, and I remember the first time I showed them was a series of 50 images at Yale. Crutzen and Stewart invited me up to do a presentation. I did a formal presentation at the end. I just showed 50 of these snapshots, thinking I was going to use them for more collage making, if you will. But then a lot of the students there, they were not even infants, or they might have been infants when these images were made. And they didn't care about who was who, but they were able to had a formal read of the work. And that was interesting to see, because several months later, I premiered 200 of them at Carrie Mae Weems Live at the Guggenheim. And there was a very different story. People were actually crying because it captured, like Elizabeth Alexander, the poet, it captured something from a period that they had lived. And it also captures and evoked for them almost a memorial, if you will, of people who had gone on. So that was the basis that I remember when Eva Raspini, she was at the MoMA at the time, and she came to visit, to the student visit, and she was saying, well, you have this archive of over 5,000 images, journals, etc. But what is the work, if you will, that comes out of the archive? And that felt like Greek to me. I didn't quite understand. I knew what she was saying, but that was like a formal challenge for me. How do I take something, all of these images, and begin to massage, if you will, to extract? And what you have right here is the first iteration that was done in Sao Paulo by Neil in 2016, then went to the Whitney, who acquired it, and then Madrid, and then the Migros Museum as well. And it was curious to me because when I first showed these, I mean, they're like friends, you know, whether my friend like Carrie Day, or, you know, being in London shooting Isaac Julian or the great Stuart Hall, etc., or nudes, you know, beaches, you know. It was interesting because I couldn't, they were, unlike my grandfather, who had a label for each one that he might have written in pencil, and mine were just like in plastic bags, you know. And so the question is, well, is that Black's Beach in San Diego, or is that Fire Island as a Provincetown, to the point of having to actually look at the grain of the sand, or, you know, I mean, really trying to get into the minutia. What bed was that exactly? Who was that? So that was an initial editing process, separating between beds and beaches, West Coast, East Coast, London, Paris, etc. So why don't we maybe show the video? It might be good to do that.
Yeah, although that just makes me think, like, because you wonder what's really the important information there. Like, does it matter where this beach was, or is it the gesture, or is it these bodies next to each other? Is that what's really the thing we want to? I mean, they both matter, I guess, but you know, it's kind of. Yeah, I think about that.
I mean, for me, my training, you know, I studied with, you know, Alan Sekula, you know, Against the Grain, you know, Catherine Lord, you know. I mean, that level of specificity was important. I mean, I'm a sucker for that, if you will. Yeah. I mean, you know, I like that, whether or not the audience or viewer needs to know that. But for the sake of a book, yes, we really drilled down on that. In fact, that was important for me. But then I think it has its own poetics, you know what I'm saying? In the context of a slideshow, for example, that one doesn't really know that. It's much more about affect, where in the context of a book, which is a different iteration, you know, then that level of specificity for me is important. And it's a way to, yeah.
All right, well, let's give it a little soundtrack for a sec.
Marlon Riggs, bell hooks.
Yeah, you want to talk us through it?
Yeah, and that's Greg Tate and Marlon Riggs. Cornell, Hilton, my mom, a former partner, soulmate of mine, Tommy here. Dennis Doorknob. Dennis, Rome. Then Klaus. Stuart Hall. The Whitney ISP. It's interesting, McKenzie, because there was a slide that we just passed that had his cum and blood, and it was only in seeing that image that I realized, in a way, that's from the Whitney ISP. And although that would become part of the watering hole in '96, that image, after Crumb, if you will, for me, functions almost as a drawing, it's mark making, that So in that sense, to answer your question, it does give a level of specificity when the project began, as opposed to, the project is dated 96, but that particular image offers evidence that although it's dated 96, that it was something that was initially triggered in 91, and it took 5 years of drilling down, back and forth, East Coast, West Coast. So I remember when I finally got those panels, and them outside my bedroom and just falling over before I put them on the brace. And the idea of having to move, if you will, through very difficult content and to apply a formal pressure, if you will, to allow stuff to emerge, etc. So.
Yeah, I love that Nan Golden's in the set sliding by there, because Nan would be the grandmother to the trans women who are mothers to me. So it's kind of like the temporality of that works differently, because Nan's about my age, I think.
Yeah, I think you're not about the same age.
Pictures would be my age, had they lived. Most aren't.
Yeah, and that was in '92. It was 6 weeks in Europe. We started in Paris, drove down to Rome, had a difficult breakup, and then I continued on to drop off my partner at the time in Prague. And then I remember driving from Prague to Berlin and passing through Dresden, and the car getting stalled at 5 p.m. in Dresden. And this is the time where, if you remember, that a lot of African students were being murdered, throughout, Eastern Europe, in certain places. So, needless to say, I did not get back in that car until I had to leave. And then the car wound up being totaled on a few weeks later when I was leaving Paris, 2 hours outside of Paris, I might have had makeup on my face from hanging out. There was this club in Cologne, a drag club, where the stage was actually where the entrance was. So once you go inside, and then once the performance began, you can't get out until it's over a few hours later. But anyway, so that was the end of the beginning of the end of the 9 lives. So
right.
So where are we now?
Is it worth pausing to just reflect on, what's our responsibility? And maybe that's not the right word. What's our agency in talking about the 80s and 90s now? For people for whom, we will have students who weren't even born. And we're talking about an era before the internet really became a thing, when we were still through the end of the Cold War. What's your feeling about how this kind of presents, and what work we're attempting to do to process that time, but particularly through these more specific lenses of experiences?
Well, fascinating question. I actually feel younger today than I did 10 years ago, and I think it is a result of working, as I was sharing with you, over the weekend. And I think it's because the energy of the youth, the hunger. In fact, I remember when Greg Bortowitz was doing a performance, curated a evening of readings of Black gay men's writing from the 80s and 90s, like Essex Hemphill or Donald Woods, etc. And this is part of the Blues for Smoke show that started at in LA, and then went to, I believe, the Whitney. And of course, Douglas Crimper was there, etc. But I was struck by it's the young generation, in the way they are applying pressure to our generation to give up, if you will, to share those archives. Because they're looking for models, if you will, whether that's ACT UP or other, even going back before, the other social movements, whether that's Black Power movement, that people are looking for those strategies of how to think about forms of formation and social formation and political agency, etc. So I'm actually drawn and enlivened by this young generation who are asking that. I'm not saying all of them, but I think there is a very strong energy coming from that direction, I think.
So, shall we talk about Flash of the Spirit a bit? I love these photographs with masks. Some of these were filed, and some of these you made upstate. I think we established when we were talking about it before. About these ones?
Well, it's interesting talking about these. The majority, and I think it was in 2018, my friend and dealer, Jeannie Greenberg, had asked me to show some works that were that the Tate Museum recently acquired, called the Construct series, that were Black male. And those works had been in storage, if you will, for, they were in storage for 25 years. And I remember when they showed in New York, I think it was first on the occasion of the publication of, my most recent book, then I believe at the Armory, that people thought they were made yesterday. And sort of relates to what you questioned before, because they had a certain freshness, even though they were done from 94. And just thinking about, and that's why I'm so inspired by this next generation, because I remember Thomas Lax, curator at the MoMA, a friend, he was saying he saw those works as a teenager. His mother took him to the Whitney and saw those works at the Whitney Black male show, and how, you never know what kind of seed you're planted. For example, let's say when I read your book, I'm Into You, I didn't know that, many years later, you and I would be having this conversation. But you never know their effect. Does it make any sense? And that's I like the power of work, or the power of ideas to be able to disseminate. For example, this this series of lectures that Fong has curated, you never know who's going to be seeing this and what type of energy or sustenance is giving to where we are right now. So I showed those, and I felt that it's possible for me to think about making a new series of images that would use a self as a way to go through certain experiments. And that happened to coincide with my uncle Harold, who was a vivid collector of African art. He traveled, throughout West Africa in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and he gifted me a couple of masks. And that, it happens, the synergy of that, the reshowing of works from, let's say, 89, and then what does it mean for a middle-aged person to really think about returning to the body as a site, pleasure and play, etc. And I think it also made me think about, I moved upstate, and I remember when I first came up here, I was sharing with you over the weekend that the guy who does the mowing of the lawn at my former landlord, and I literally had to take myself out of his peripheral vision, because I was thinking, this guy's 6'4", he's white as said, of course he's Trump supporter, plus he has guns, and he says he never kills anything in his life. But it was sort of like thinking about, how do I move beyond projecting onto the other? And so this image is a way to engage the landscape, if you will, to go in to think about notions of the body, the landscape, etc. So.
Well, as I said on Saturday, you're looking good, honey. I mean, I'm all for I'm all for a body of a certain age in the image here. I no longer have my previous.
And as I responded to you, it's so interesting just thinking about, I think, and the wisdom that comes with that, the fact that we're able, the grace of being alive today, number one, where several people in the AIDS, crisis, how many people have lost, archives, people, etc. And what does it mean to have the wisdom of having lived through that, or as my friend Layden says, having seen the devil and been able to tell the story, being able to live through that and to take pleasure in play, if that makes any sense. So this is an interesting, I'm sorry?
No, I was just immediately thinking of that bit in Sarah Schulman, where she talks about walking down the street and there's seeing a dumpster full of playbills and knowing another gay man has just died.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And so it's an image that trades on a cliche, but it's also real. There's so much of pieces of culture that fell away at that time. And perhaps even more intensely then for Black and brown queer people. And trans people as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why it was so. Getting back to one of your early questions in terms of the issues around the Dharma-esque or the issues around the early body of work. I mean, just thinking about this is prior to Disney moving into 42nd Street. Just thinking about the pleasure and the sensuality of the city, and there's a longing for that. At the same time, let's also talk about the element of violence, the fact that the watering hole was a way to work through, in a way, because it wasn't just about not only institutional, racism or homophobia, or just in terms of, occupying the street, if you will. So in a way that it was a way to somehow process and to, process that.
So do you want to tell me about Untitled Dad? Who is the letter to and from?
Well, that's the letter I just mentioned to you. It's a letter to my father,
Right.
my late father,
Yeah.
who I had a challenging relationship with, a difficult relationship with. So, I remember I was talking, to the friend, philosopher Anthony Appiah, and talking about, although we had a very different relationship, maybe his ultimate sacrifice that he wasn't around, because in a way it gave me Africa. I'm just thinking about what it meant to be the second generation St. Kitts man, being handsome and beautiful, and also dealing and not being able to, like, say, cope, if you will, with like racism and the inability to be able to deal in a way. And it's curious because I think he produced two queer sons, if you will, and what does it mean to, in a way, to embody certain gifts from him also as a way to give to the next generation. So what was curious about this for me, this is from the Guggenheim installation, but the dad collage actually has its origins at Participant, Leah, the lovely, brilliant Leah. And when I was in Paris when I found out that my father had passed away, and I didn't know what I was going to do for the show, and then I decided to do this performance. And it was interesting because people, whether that, like my mother was there, or let's say Mackenzie Thomas or Zadie Smith, all of this is very personal archive. The level of agency people felt that came and told me afterwards about their own father story.
Right, yeah.
So that was interesting, something which is highly personal, archive, engendered a possibility for others to reveal their own experience that I had not, up to that point, was not aware of.
Now, the first thing I want to ask you about these ones is it's dye sublimation on aluminium, these ones. Can you just tell me a little bit about the process?
Well, these are dye sublimations, which the ink is baked directly onto the aluminum itself. And I first began working with these shadow works, I believe, in 2017. This is the first one that was done for my good friend and dealer David Castillo in Miami. And I was thinking about, it's curious. What I love about this one in particular, is that I tend to, I guess, I'm into mark making. I'll shoot something, and it may be another 10 years before something has a way of emerging. I mean, I'm not one, if that makes any sense. I mean, clearly I work in a certain sense. I want to do a series of photographs, portraits, what have you. But the shadow works are definitely another deep dive, if you will, into the archive. It's not, let's say, not the ethical archive, but these are images. For example, if you look the upper right image, well, it's actually the left panel, upper right image on the left panel, I should say. It's of a figure, that one. And that, it's an image, although this is 2017, that image is from an early romantic obsessive of mine from high school. That's actually, in my bedroom in the Bronx, what I'm saying? Wow. And the fact that I kept that image, and it has a way, it's surfaced in the watering hole. And then you think you're done, and then images have a way of resurfacing, if you will. Yeah. So the backgrounds are all materials that I sourced in Ghana. As I mentioned, I was living there, and my partner at the time, Prince Mafo, he's the grandson of the village wife of a former president of Ghana. And it was great, although I had the academic experience there, to be involved with him, who's a bodybuilder. So I had sort of a high-low culture, if you will. So I was able to get into... I was able to get into Ashanti funerals. I mean, you don't just happen upon an Ashanti funeral. I mean, it's very deep, rich, ancient culture. And I was struck by the relationship to death. And unlike the West, where there's a certain finality, the fact that, in fact, I was doing some research that African-American funerary practice is more akin to a Khan funerary practice, that there is an arc within that. There is clearly the grieving of the body, but within that, there is thanksgiving, that one is able to honor the ancestors and be able to have the element of rejuvenation or celebration after that. So all the fabric, the majority of the fabric is Ghanaian funerary fabric. This one is Black Power is titled after all the people credit that term to Stokely Carmichael after I think it was Malcolm X was died. It was actually came into cultural significance 10 years before when the late Richard Wright was invited by Nkrumah, who was making, when Ghana was making a transition, the first sub-Saharan African independence, and his travelogue about his travelogue traveling in Ghana in 56, 57 was called Black Power. Yeah. So that's that piece right here.
And they seem to have a different relation to the archive, to me at least, in terms of a kind of elegiac feeling, maybe, that the memories come back with a different feeling, that a kind of formal beauty is maybe going on here that's different. I just wonder how you feel about reprocessing one's past at a certain, shall we say, life stage, that these things start to feel a little different, and then how one gives aesthetic expression to that?
Well, it's curious because the images, clearly some of them are sourced from the past, and then you have a recent portrait of Ta-Nehisi Coates that I photographed, let's say, for the cover story for New York Magazine. So I think in this particular piece, Double Gasper, there's obviously, the dreadlocks, that I rediscovered after, let's say, 30 years in the archive. I don't know. I guess it gets back to some of the earlier concerns of, let's say, some of the water in terms of applying sort of a formal pressure, if you will. But I guess there is an element of elegiac element. I think through the use of like filter, the mirroring, and also the veiling, if you will. I think that's been a repeating motif. I would say, in the work.
Yeah, and to me, there's
also trying to somehow excavate the surface. For example, piece of pottery right here is actually something I had purchased when I was in Ghana. It's used to crush pepper, something you can get in the market for less than $1. And in fact, my dear friend soulmate had suggested after break, and this is something that I transported as if it was a very precious object, but something was precious to me that it allowed me to, after leaving Ghana, after returning to the States in 2013, to hold on, if you will, to the memories that was so important to me, so influential to when I traveled there. I remember going to the airport, there was a sign that says, Ghana still has the British former colonial buggery laws, and so what it meant for me to go in professorial drag, if you will. Often I was carrying 3 or 4 laptops, as gifts for people. I know how to dress the drag, and that in this sense is professorial, so I'm not checked at the border, if that makes any sense. Meanwhile, at the corner of my eye, there's a sign that Ghana does not, Ghanaian society does not condone pedophilia and other such things, and we know what that's code word for. And so in a way, it was a way to reclaim that aspect. I remember it's curious. Why? Because why did I collect these materials? I had no idea how they would manifest. And I've given a lot of these fabrics away. But I guess this maybe, in a way, it speaks to, I guess, my process in terms of, let's say, accumulation. There's that seminal 77 article, on African art. There's something about accumulation and the agency or the power that comes through that, and
to me, I feel like, how do you make work that doesn't ignore but kind of reprocesses Western art history tradition that's in here somewhere, but it's not necessarily featured, or it's not the controlling discourse. How is that then reprocessed through an everyday life, through the archive of a life or a set of lives that those aesthetic practices ignore or never accounted for or repressed? So to me, it seems like you've sort of gone through all these stages to like build the materials and the layers and the practices and the experience to be able to make these things, to me, like extraordinary formal beauty at this stage of your career and life. I don't know. I'm just riffing on what an extraordinary achievement.
No, it's interesting because I was thinking, going back to the work, and you also love like the mask work, the Flash of the Spirit. I remember when Nancy Spector came down, for a visit, and she was saying that it was daring, considering the controversy around the, I think the '84 MoMA show on primitivism and what does it mean to return to that scene of the crime, if you will. The fact is, are there certain things that are unleft? I mean, that still need to be processed, And, similarly, I mean, I think there is a certain, I don't know, I'm not sure if it's masking or that's going on in these, but I don't know. I almost think that one is constantly in the process, I mean, for me, in terms of making work, of like, I don't know, leaving cues, if you will. I mean, leaving, leaving traces. I mean, I'm not sure if it has a lot to do with maybe living, HIV for 31 years. The fact that evidence that there's something that exists, if that makes any sense, there's that. And then there's also, that, I don't know. I mean, it's curious. I'm just thinking about what does it mean. I mean, I hope the audience doesn't take this, affront to being anointed to be able to tell a story in the matter of a griot. Does that make any sense? And to reimagine what is possible and to claim that space. So it's a personal archive, but one is actually mapping out, getting back to the fact that the incendiary reaction that I got to the watering hole, let's say, and I know people have lost, during the last, in terms of losing stuff in storage. I mean, what is, in all of my acting out, if you will, of all, the pleasure of youth, what was that guiding force, if you will, that actually guided or hovered over the archive that not only is about me, but is about offering a future generation this archive? For example, like I love Nan. I was influenced by Nan's archive, but what was on the other side? If you're thinking about a curator, a friend now, at the Whitney, for example, think of the Black Male Show, or let's say the Black Popular Culture Conference that happened at the Dia Center for the Arts, collaboration with the Dia Center for the Arts, and let's say the Student Museum in Harlem. Now, there is a level of cultural amnesia around these moments in artist circle moments where there was a certain synergy that was happening. And if there's not an evidence of that, then it doesn't exist. So my question to myself, I'm not sure if that's a burden of representation or not, but what was the guiding force, And I think that comes out, let's say, within the ancestral play that's happening, whether, let's say, in the Flash of the Spirit, or clearly seeping through, if you will, through the shadow works. What was that energy? Now, and I don't know if I can describe that. I'm not sure it's my role to name what that was. That was a custodian of that. Being a sissy, a queer from the Bronx, negotiating that and expanding out. I mean, what does it mean to somehow apply the pressure to the culture to open up, whether that's in the Bronx or Ghana or in Paris, wherever, if that makes any sense. I'm thinking of a show that I co-curated with Rob Stewart and Peter Benson Miller at the American Academy in Rome in I think it was 2005, because a fellow trustee at the Academy, Frank Snowden, the great Frank Snowden, who was Professor Emeritus. In fact, he wrote a wonderful piece recently in the New Yorker on epidemics. And his father was at Harvard around the same time Du Bois was, the great Du Bois, right? And he went to the American Academy in the mid-50s to work the transcribe or to massage, if you will, his thesis on Blacks in antiquity into a book. And at the time, he was informed by the director of the American Academy that there were Southerners, white Southerners, who did not feel comfortable housing, being under the same roof as an African-American person, Black person, what have you, right? And the irony is that a few years later, that Frank Snowden Sr. was appointed as the cultural attaché, the first African-American in the history, under the Claire Booth, who was the first female ambassador. So again, I'm interested. So basically, the show was a trigger to talk about issues of Black culture in the diaspora in relationship to Italian culture. So I'm just thinking about the trajectory of the young kid in the Bronx, let's say, being called, and what does it mean to apply pressure? I'm interested in the energy that helped, because I want to also give voice for those who did not make it. I mean, let's say for those who, let's be clear that, in 2020, how many young queer youth today, trans youth today, either being murdered or committing suicide, et cetera. I had a student of mine at NYU, whose father, she was queer, who was gonna have pulled the plug on, on the tuition because she came out. So I think it's important, to think about how expansive we have been, but in the arena of what we might think are very progressive, they are deeply conservative strains, and how do we, so that's what I think makes the work even much more important today, if that makes any sense.
Oh, totally, yeah. How does one, create and hold space that others can come into and make work with? Strikes me as particularly important, not least in the current moment that we're in now. All right, so...
But I've been cooking a lot. I want to just say that, I was sheltering down with a friend for 27 years, and I'm great, 27 years, 27 days. And I've been cooking, it's been amazing to be making, I made wild caught soup for the first. I can't wait to make dinner for you and Funk. I think that's one thing I love to do. That's what I'm probably best at. It's making food and hosting. That's one thing that gives me tremendous joy. So.
Well, somebody asked which Sarah Schulman book I was talking about. I don't remember, but I think it's Rat Bohemia. Rat Bohemia's got a lot of stuff about the passing of a certain kind of gay culture. It's my favorite of Sarah's books. Do people have other questions? You could start to feed them in. I think we're around about at that moment.
Okay. So I'll transition. I agree. I think it would be a great time to transition into the Q&A portion.
Can we see faces? Maybe I should look gallery. I have it now. I want to actually see faces for the first time. Oh my God.
Change the view. I took the slideshow off.
Our first question is coming from Nick Bennett from the Brooklyn Rail staff. So Nick, I think you're unmuted.
Hi, Alex. Hi, Nick.
Hi. Thank you so much, Lyle. And my question kind of goes back to where the conversation started. And I had the pleasure of working with Fong on the 2017 Occupy Mana show, which was sort of like a reaction to the beginning.
I remember,
yes.
But
yes, and it was incredible to see the Watering Hole series for the first time in person in that show. And I remember looking at it very closely, and there were, you used these news clippings of men in Africa that would lure other gay men and then attack or I think even kill them. And then of course you used images of Jeffrey Dahmer. And I'm curious how in that work you were thinking through and personally relate to the predator and the gay male gaze, that sense of violence.
Well, that's a very interesting question. But just for clarification, in the show, which is a wonderful show, there were 2 Watering Hole works, but there was also a more recent work called Deceivers and Money Boys. And that's what you're referencing. And that's actually from 2013. So the question, can you repeat the question for me, please, in terms of issues of ambivalence and desire and violence? And can you?
So yeah, I mean, connecting the.
Can we see you, Nick?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you see me?
Yes.
I've kind of a spotty connection today, but
Okay, that's my requirement when I'm teaching. Roll, roll call begins when I see the face.
I am virtually here. But no, I'm curious how. But thank you for clarifying though on that being the more recent project. But I guess in how they connect, I guess I'm curious how you personally relate to that sense of the predator or violent, predatory behavior within a gay context or within the gays.
Well, I think it. I think the watering hole is equally influenced, let's say, by whether that's Jeffrey Dahmer or Looking for Mr. Goodbar. So I don't think one is specific to, let's say, to queer culture, or they have its own component, if you will. I mean, I'm struck by the level of provocative imagery, if you will, even on the internet. I'm not talking about like, apps or whatever. I don't do apps, but the point being is, let's say, Instagram and the suggestiveness in COVID-19, how many exercise equipment are being sold, and the using of the body, if you will, to solicit a reaction. And I mean, it's curious, I'm thinking about like in the early 90s, studying with Connie Hatch, and I think there's some unfinished business in terms of the study of image making and how images are used to somehow control people. And I'm interested in the awareness of that, to the extent to which how that filters, pollutes, let's say, for me, other forms of transaction, if that makes any sense. So I don't think it's just, let's say, violence that happens within, let's say, community. I mean, clearly there is. I mean, as we spoke about in terms of, trans violence or psychic violence within, within queer communities. I mean, clearly there's physical violence, but there's this well-known gay therapist, I'm forgetting, Clifford Odette, Walt Odette, who's the son of Clifford Odette, came out with a book recently about gay male identity, and to what extent how in the arena of gay marriage, or what's going on with the inability for people to have human connections, So I'm less interested in fetishizing violence, if you will. Clearly the Jeffrey Dahmer piece, or the piece you mentioned, Deceivers and Moneyball, that's an extreme iteration, but I'm also interested in the more subtle ways and equally dangerous how we consume the other. And that particularly in COVID-19, for example. I remember a student of mine last year, a couple of years, he just graduated from NYU, and Chinese, came from an affluent background, and he was being told on social media, gay app, or someone said there are more Chinese here than on the wall of China. So I'm interested in the realm of, let's say, pleasure or desire, the level of violence that maybe an extreme serial killer is one version, but how are we all implicated in the consumption of the other, and how can we find other ways of relating with each other, if that makes any sense.
It does. Thank you. And thank you for making that work.
Thank you. Ooh.
Our next question is coming from lovely JC. JC, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Lyle and Mackenzie, thank you so much for this conversation. Hearing these histories, hey Mackenzie, hearing these histories is such a bright spot in my week. My question is, it's a little rambly, so I apologize in advance.
Please. Yeah.
Okay, so the Roman strangers images in your Italia series express what feels like really intimate desire, and in a very public setting, and like the viewfinder almost feels implicated. You can kind of like feel the actual camera apparatus, which to me feels like you're sort of like forcing the viewer into your vision. And the viewer is very much kind of present in your eye there. And I feel like those images share an interest. I'm going to connect this to Mackenzie's work. I feel like they share an interest with Reverse Cowgirl in making queer desire something to be kind of publicly reckoned with.
Yeah.
Yes, those are the images, and they're beautiful. I really love those. And they do so in very different ways, obviously, but the images kind of eroticize the public anonymity, and the book sort of makes extremely intimate moments public, but they both put the audience into a queer perspective. And so I guess my question is, Lyle, I'm curious if you think about your viewer in a kind of literary or readership sort of way in those images. Like, are you thinking about the viewer as somebody who's going to be reading and looking through your eyes there? And then Mackenzie, if you have anything to add about about those images, or how you think about images in your work, I would be grateful to hear from either or both of you.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I'm the ultimate viewer. I mean, ultimately, I want company to accompany me to the ledge, if you will. But that I don't. There may be a core group of people that in any project that I know are gonna, push me to that next edge, if you will. And there, I can name them now, but there's a few of them, who are gonna ask me to, and but I'll respond to these. I mean, these, because I think they were, and this element of scopophilia, obviously. I mean, I was shooting with, like, just to give a little specs, this is in Rome. This is I did the American Academy in 2000, and it was an amazing experience, and I love the Academy, the American Academy. And I was shooting with a Nikon with a 180 lens. So it really, it could be, a good 15, 20 feet away from the subject. So the Roman strangers, in that I didn't know any of the people. And they were shot. In fact, it wasn't until a couple of years after I shot them that I found out that one of the people in the photographs was the fourth wife of the late Boetti, the great artist Boetti. And I was not aware of that. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't until it was a curator at the British School in Rome who identified. So these are people that I were photographing, on the street, around Piazza Navona, places that, other places more, throughout, whether that's, in Verona or Bari, etc. So I think there is a certain longing, if you will, in the act of looking, or desire, without question. Yeah, so.
I mean, I think what troubles and puzzles and intrigues a lot of trans artists and writers is what do we do about the cis gays, and what even is it? Like, it's not even really been thought yet. So I folded that into the book, so that there's at least one scene of like public sex in Reverse Cowgirl. Maybe only one, but there's one comes at a key moment where it's me getting fucked in a dungeon that people will recognize if you do that sort of thing in New York, because I just described the layout of it, and there aren't that many, so people will go, oh yeah, I've been to that one for such and such a night, which is kind of hilarious. But it's I'm getting fucked while being watched, and so then it's the men with their dicks in their hands watching that happen. So like I've put the reader into the book, so it's the same thing of the viewfinder occurring in the book. And I think that's paired with a quote from Robert Gluck, who describes exactly the same thing. The thing is that it's not unique to me, and I think this relates to this question of, when you're digging in an archive or in memory, on the one hand it's personal, on the other hand it's not. Like, it's immediately implicated in these quite specific sort of social fields that you might want to selectively bring back into the present. But yeah, to me that's the work, is how do you kind of construct the possibility of the ongoingness of certain lives that are not necessarily institutionally very well represented.
Our next question is for Lyle, and it's from me. A little unorthodox. So I really loved what you were saying a little while back about Black culture in the diaspora, and that really resonated with me. And I was thinking a little about sort of like the feedback loop or the reciprocity between like American Black liberation and like African kind of anti-colonial liberation, like specifically in Ghana, specifically like what you were saying about like the phrase, like how Black power came from the travelogue, you know, from someone like going through Kwame Nkrumah's era of Ghana. And I don't know, I really love that moment of the kind of like radical, like international solidarity projects that like Kwame Nkrumah was taking up, really successfully inviting people, that there was a kind of like marvelous like cross-pollination or cross-travel happening then, from which people could draw strength on the US side. And like, this is a very
back and forth in a way too.
Yeah. And this is obviously a weird question, but we know how that ended, right? With a kind of a US covert takedown of those moments, you know, both on the Ghanaian side, but a little bit here as well. And so my question is like, what would the American liberation leaders like of this moment, who do you imagine they would look to as like international collaborators, or from what can, I guess my question is this, like, from what can we draw strength in this moment that might have a similar kind of base or relationship?
Fascinating question. I mean, in COVID-19 or in general? What do you think right now?
I was thinking in general, but I feel like COVID-19 has like doused gasoline over so many of the problems that were already like aflame here.
Yeah, I think what's become apparent, you know, is that we can no longer look for the hero. I think, I mean, clearly, I think it's a much more lateral, you know, if I think about movements such as Black Lives Matter or the Me Too or trans movement or the energies that are happening, let's say, the indigenous movements throughout Latin. I mean, just thinking about the importance for harnessing those and to be thinking about collective dialogues among those people. You know, I think that for us, I think that is a much more, I think that's where agency lies, as opposed to thinking that looking for one. If you think about, you know, art for social justice, and I think it's important to really look at ways to move beyond a model that power is going to the hero or one person. I think we have to look at the hero inside of ourselves and to somehow support social movements that are happening like globally today, you know, and I think that is really critical.
Okay, great, thank you. We have one more question from the audience. Melora, are you here? Let's see. I'm going to unmute you now.
Oh my gosh. Hi, I'm so excited to ask my question to Lyle. Hi, Lyle.
Hi.
You know, I've always wanted to ask you, I'm very interested in the process of I think you're known for two-dimensional work mostly, and the transition of bringing performance and video into the spectrum of your work. Did you have to negotiate with your gallery to include it? And, you know, how was that transition for you? I'm interested because I'm, you know, for my own work, I'm struggling with that.
I don't think, thank you for your question. I don't think the negotiation is with an outside, you know, entity, whether that's an institution or et cetera. I think it's about the having to give oneself the agency to move into that particular field, if you will, you know, if that makes any sense, you know, to be able to explore. I know for me, in my case, my work has been performative for many years, but it wasn't until I did this performance at Yale for the Michael Jackson conference that I had threatened to do a live performance, and I did one, you know, but yes, I think it's really about the in trusting oneself can one actually push one's boundary, if you will. And I think the audience will always be there. I think it's really about to what extent is one able to somehow push oneself, and the audience, from my experience, comes. It's there. It comes into formation.
Okay. And our last question will come from our very own Fong Bui.
Hi, Lyles.
Hi.
By the way, the movie that you referenced into was one of the first movies that I saw when I first came to the U.S. in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Looking for Mr. Goodbar was Richard Brooke, 1977, I think, movie, which starred Danny Keaton, who played a teacher who taught deaf children during the day and then go to single boy at night, looking for rough sex, and played by Richard Gere. At any rate, my question...
Richard Gere is in that?
Yes, he played the rough boyfriend. I want to ask you maybe both in a way, because when I last saw the work, I was at the Guggenheim show, the Implicit Tension Maple Tour show, that you have 3 beautiful works there. One is the collage piece, and the other is a little bit early work, but wherever the work were there, it always spoke so much in the betweenness of your interest in subculture. I mean, there's a graffiti quality to the work, for sure. Your use of collage is unlike anyone's. But there's also a strong solemn ceremonial present in the work too. So between that, I feel what makes your work so unique. And I just felt asking, I know each work have a different kind of mediation, but tell us more about your sense of collage. I mean, how did that fit into the very early formation when so much going on in the particularly late 80s, where people were trying to get out of the idea of simulacra and simulation. And I know you're one of the few artists by the early 90s were able to break free from that. Does that make sense?
Interesting question. Good. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. I'm trying to see. I put my head around it. I think I could respond to that by saying that the form came out of necessity, if you will. Particularly after my first show, which was about the nation, the family portraits, etc. That I was looking for a form that could encapsulate, if you will, the disparateness, as opposed to the pressure to distill and make an iconic image, which is something I can do, that there was pressure, if you will, to a much more to engage the discursive, if you will. And that definitely was, I credit, my experience of being at Cal Arts. It was, Wesleyan was amazing, but there was something about trying to find a form or that I could encapsulate the multitude of experiences, if you will. And I think, clearly there's a very important, I think it's important conversation between Mike Kelly and the great artist of kids, Larry Clark, in Flash Art. I remember seeing that. There was a conversation between the two of them. It was a small little reproduction. And just seeing an early Mark making, that was one influence. Clearly looking at the work of, the great Hannah Hawk, for example, thinking about how it took decades for her, it was Lindsay Levansky, because she was a quote unquote a stepchild of the Dadaists, and the fact that, several decades later, how she has emerged as being, the representative of that particular movement, thinking about her ethnographic series. So I was also trying to think about how a form that could I guess, engage the content, but also I guess maybe interrogate the viewer. If you think about the early black and white works, that in a way the way in which they were being fetishized by the art world, etc. And I felt like I needed something, I needed a work, I needed a methodology that could, I guess, to use that example term, to apply, to make it harder for myself, to apply pressure to a way of visualizing, let's say, this very ambivalent, complicated space where there wasn't any answer. The fact that the work did not become a space in which you actually was nicely tied up, but the fact that it was about the unfinished business. It was about temporarily about the fact that one could have a necessary stopping point, but the fact that it wasn't formation. And that's the kind of work that most intrigues me, the fact that a viewer is implicated, but they also are part of the process for its completion, if you will. The fact that it's never complete, but the fact that the viewer is given that, trusting the viewer, including myself, to present them with a series of clues, if you will, and that how do they both formally, conceptually, theoretically engage, but to be challenged by them. And that's, for me, some of the most interesting work, and that's what makes it lasting. What am I battling with this work? I mean, how does it get to? I remember I got Adrian Piper said to me many years ago, I think I met her through Maurice Berger, and she said my work was ancient. And I didn't quite understand what that meant, but the fact there were something that I had touched in her, if that makes any sense, that it's never complete. The fact that it continues, the fact that one maybe has to put a necessary framing on it, but the fact that it continues to breathe, it continues to grow, is something that it gets completed over and over and over through someone experiencing it. So,
but that's the reference about graffiti. I don't mean graffiti in the East Village.
Yeah.
In the Bronx, Harlem, I met like early on, like cave paintings, where you see the handprint.
Yeah.
I mean, that reference, maybe Adrian was right to call it ancient, but that's the solemn ceremonial aspects of the work that I always find very.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you both so much. So the Rail has a daily ritual of ending lunch with a poem. Today, the wonderful Charlie Schultz, our managing editor, will be reading for us. Charlie?
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Lyle and Mackenzie. It was such a fabulous conversation to listen to. Really, really made the week start wonderfully for me. I chose a poem from Rainer Maria Rilke's selected poems, translated by Robert Bly, who is one of my favorite translators of Rilke. This poem is called The Panther, and I also chose it because it set Rilke off on a new path of writing, specifically about the things that he was seeing. And I just thought that felt apropos with Lyle being our featured guest today.
Can we just see the cover a little higher, please? Thank you. Thank you.
This poem's for you, Lyle. The Panther. From seeing the bars, his seeing is so exhausted that it no longer holds anything anymore. To him, the world is bars, 100,000 bars, and behind the bars, nothing. The lithe swinging of that rhythmical, easy stride, which circles down to the tiniest hub, is like a dancer of energy around a point in which a great will stands stunned and numb. Only at times, the curtains of the pupil rise without a sound. Then a shape enters, slips through the tightened silence of the shoulders, reaches the heart, and dies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And please join us again tomorrow for Dorothea Rockburn and Phyllis Tuchman at 1 p.m.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mackenzie.
Thank you, Lyle.
Thank you,
Mackenzie. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me, Lyle. A pleasure.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Thank you, Lyle.
I look forward to the next time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care.
Have a great lunch.
Yeah.
I think you can unmute yourself if you want to unmute and say farewell.
Bye,
Say
Jason.
bye on your way out.
Farewell. Lyle, see you later.
Bye,
Good to hear
Fred.
you.
Okay, thank
Maybe
you.
next time then.
Hey.
Have a good summer.
Bye, Tina.
Bye.
Thank you, Lyle. You're fabulous.
Ciao, Billy.
Bye.
Love you. Bye.
Take care.
Jason.
Bye, Lyle.
Ciao, Aggie.
Bye, Sophia.
Bye. Bye, Lyle.
Bye-bye, everyone. Hi, Aggie.
Bye.
How you doing?
Okay, how are you?
I miss you.
I miss you too. I haven't seen you for a while.
I know.
So this was nice to see you. And then
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's great spending time with Paul.